Breaking news just into our newsroom this morning. Jeffrey Epstein committed suicide overnight. ABC News reporting he was found dead in his lower Manhattan jail cell. He was the disgraced millionaire who was facing federal sex trafficking charges. He was set to stand trial next year for allegedly abusing dozens of minor girls in New York and Florida. Big news this morning.
There is a part of me that's happy that Charlie Kirk is dead. He was a racist, misogynistic nationalist whose opinions that he gladly shared with the world among other right-wing pundits contributed to a massive shift in the culture to dangerous levels of far-right activism and extremism that, by the time of his death, had cemented itself in an almost cult-like political sphere across the world that actively enforced incredibly regressive policies. On top of this, he was also not very smart, and when he wasn't debating overly emotional first-year college students, he would usually stumble over his own arguments and expose himself as someone who didn't really know what he was talking about. This is something not specific to Kirk, but we will return to this later on. For now, I want to speak more about his death, which I want to be on the record saying I would rather didn't happen. Violence of any kind is bad, but on September 10th, 2025, Charlie Kirk was shot in the neck with a hunting rifle from 130 meters away whilst holding a public debate in Utah Valley University. I remember this happening. I was eating Ben & Jerry's chocolate fudge brownie whilst watching an episode of Deadwood. I saw in real time the immediate conspiracies unfold, that it was planned, that Trump did it, that Israel did it, that trans people did it somehow. It was all very speculatory and sensational for the first couple of days, but then something simultaneously very typical but also kind of jarring started to happen. Memes. Everything started to be Kirkified. His wife was ridiculed for her odd grieving style, and the man's violent and gruesome death had become a complete laughingstock for everyone apart from the MAGA cult. Even saying his last name makes a part of me giggle still. I'm not going to pretend I was clutching my pearls. I laughed a lot at them too, but at the same time I couldn't help but notice just how egregious this mockery was. At the end of the day, a guy died, and instead of his death being celebrated or honoured, there didn't seem to be a clear distinction as to the motivations of the humour behind these memes. It seemed that the joke wasn't that Charlie Kirk, a right-wing activist, had been assassinated. It seemed that the joke was simply just, Charlie Kirk has been assassinated. The memes seemed remarkably apolitical in intention, and were just funny because of how unserious they were despite a person being shot and killed. Something that's supposed to be shocking was now a place you got to laugh. I want to be clear that I'm not an idiot, and I understand that this is how a lot of humour works. The juxtaposition between the very serious and the very unserious is foundational to a millennia of joke-telling. It's just this time, a guy died, and he didn't just die, he got brutally murdered on camera. I remember when Margaret Thatcher, O.J. Simpson, Dick Cheney all died, and I don't remember this amount of mockery involved. It was a bunch of jokes and people celebrating their deaths, but I still see nearly 9 months later edits of Kirk dancing in shopping centre food courts and the like. And it got me wondering if any of this is actually a good thing. As John Lennon famously said, you look for the person who will benefit, and I didn't really like the answer I arrived at, and I think this could all probably lead to something a lot more sinister. In fact, I think we should all stop indulging in this. I think we should all probably stop laughing. The 1990s were perhaps the most politically stable and liberal decade the West has ever seen. The Cold War had just ended and the Soviet Union collapsed. The US were now established as the world's main superpower and had entered a period of democratic neoliberalism under Clinton. The UK had 2 stable terms from John Major and then moved on to British Clinton Tony Blair, an incredibly suave and charismatic neoliberal with socially progressive views. The West was, for the first time in a while, the pillars of political and social stabilisation, with the rest of the world seemingly on fire outside of our walls. Rwanda, Yugoslavia and Congo were amidst genocides, and Boris Yeltsin's political career was becoming disastrous by the time of his second term. In David F. Marx's book, Blank Space, Marx points to numerous cultural artefacts that attest to this cultural rebellion. The movie Kids showcased a generation of violent, promiscuous, drug-taking teens. MTV showcased countercultural experimentation and even started a pro-democracy campaign called Choose or Lose to encourage people to vote for Bill Clinton. And the Strokes, with their don't give a shit aesthetic, despite being wealthy industry plants, sang about the disillusionment with contemporary American life and the stupidity of its establishments, rightfully revitalising what Nirvana had left behind after Kurt Cobain's death. Cultural expression of the 1990s were heavily inspired by going against the status quo, embracing decadence and upsetting squares. That was until 2001. Douglas Copeland described 9/11 as the beginning of the 21st century. The overnight cultural shift can barely be fathomed. All of these anti-establishment rhetorics and expressions from the previous 10 years disappeared immediately because of just how offensive they felt in the wake of thousands of people being brutally killed in the name of attacking the West where it hurt. There was a call now for patriotism, jingoism, and a callback to conservative ideals to unify America in the face of these foreign oppressors. If you now said anything that could be interpreted as anti-American, you would be punished. Susan Sontag received scathing criticism for questioning the Bush administration. Bill Maher's politically incorrect show was cancelled for doing the exact same thing. And Karl-Heinz Stockhausen's scheduled performance in New York was cancelled after he called 9/11 Lucifer's great work of art. The message was clear: nationalism was back. A problem with this sentiment was that capitalist mythology also made a return. Capitalism and the West can be seen as almost interchangeable, with one reinforcing the other. Capitalism wouldn't be where it is without the West, and the West wouldn't be where it is without capitalism. In fact, George Bush would even urge American citizens to go shopping and go to Disney World as a form of patriotism during this time. But we'll talk about capitalism's more gradual influence later on. What I want to focus on first was the problem of irony. The general atmosphere of the West at this time can be compared to the first hour of a wake, where everyone is still unsure if they can laugh or even smile at a joke. Regular programming, of course, continued and new shows emerged after 9/11, but it was more about what you couldn't joke about anymore, and more specifically, how you could joke about it. People were understandably confused. The irony and the irreverence that pervaded the 90s, that was used for subversion and detachment from commercialism and authority, was now seen, even by its previous users, as largely irresponsible and ignorant of the tragedies of 9/11. Counterculture had lost faith in itself. As thinkers like David Foster Wallace and Slavoj Žižek have put it, irony can only really do so much. It is, in essence, a cynical detachment method that, although exposes hypocrisy in systems, still participates in the systems it criticises. It becomes a cultural dead end. Soon we were back to shows like Entourage and Sex and the City and films like Pursuit of Happiness and Devil Wears Prada, and we started to see the dawn of the superhero genre, of likes of Batman Begins and Iron Man, all of which glamorised the very things liberal media in the 90s criticised. Entrepreneur saviorism, vanity, status, and hustling until it all finally pays off. If the 90s were a return to the 70s, then the 2000s were a return to the 80s. Consequently, irony was relegated to the internet, a place at the time that was seen as secondary to television and cinema. A meme, according to Merriam-Webster, is an amusing or interesting item, such as a captioned picture or video, or genre of items that is spread widely online, especially through social media. This is the standard and very basic description, and so I turned to Xiao Mina's book, Memes to Movements, for a better understanding of what a meme really is. Mina states that a meme is a transmission mechanism with the unique ability to invite participation. The simplicity of a meme allows for an immediate transmission of symbols and messages that are not just consumed but also altered time and again, becoming their own living organism of cultural material. Mina uses the very early meme of lolcat to exemplify this phenomenon. The lolcat meme started in approximately 2006 on 4chan as politically useless images with the now incredibly dated top-bottom text format, whose humour was found within the cats themselves. Lolcats took off quickly and for some years were a recognisable part of internet culture that had been modified over and over again to the point where there were millions of renditions. This was one of the first peaks into the meme's power and their specificity as a form of communication that no other form used. Memes, for their first years of widespread existence, were where postmodern subversive humour lived alongside niche outlets like Adult Swim or The Lonely Island. This type of humour had a place to go again, but like all things pure and innocent, it soon got the attention of much higher powers. When the markets crashed in 2008, the virtues of capitalism that the 2000s had thus far lauded itself on faced a massive legitimacy crisis. The West entered recession, unemployment skyrocketed, and wages stagnated. It was after this that the left started to emerge from hiding behind Jon Stewart and began to openly be subversive again, and started to capitalise on the past few years of memes. With inspiration from the Arab Spring, Occupy took off as a response to the financial crisis of 2008, using the meme's simple, immediate, and symbolic format to fuel the fire. It was largely championed with the use of hashtags and slogans that cut right deep into the core of the issue. Coney 2012, which came a year later, aimed to do the exact same thing. Despite both of these movements eventually failing, it seemed that the left had woken up again and started to see the internet and memetics as a place to enact actual change. I believe this, paired with the first African-American presidency and the legalization of gay marriage, instilled a belief in liberals that things were naturally heading towards a more progressive and inclusive society. Unfortunately, this exploitation of internet culture from the left ended up being a double-edged sword. Prior to the internet, human beings encountered the world through empirical participation. Politics was there right in front of you. It was real and tangible. In order for you to participate, you would have to attend sit-ins and protests and the likes. You would actually have to show up. After the internet, however, and left-wing politics' movement to the internet, progressives started to become alienated from their own worldviews. As Guy Debord and Donald Nicholson-Smith point out in their book, The Society of Spectacle, participation becomes representation. Affirmative action was now abstracted through hashtags, memes, infographics, and the share button underneath articles. Consuming these representations became tantamount to actual participation in the political sphere, leading to what Peter Sloterdijk famously calls enlightened false consciousness, in which the progressive understands thoroughly the conditions of his plight, but continues to operate within the condition anyways. Representational activism was not affirmative action, it was the guilt-free accommodation to capitalism. A perfect example of this was when in 2020 a lot of people posted black squares to symbolise their activism and participation in the Black Lives Matter movement, when in reality all this really did was block people from accessing real resources to help the victims of police brutality and institutional racism. We're skipping ahead a little, but the point's clear. The individual will represent their participation in a progressive movement, sometimes with the full knowledge that it's not going to do anything, and will then go to sleep that night with the hope that they're a good person and definitely not racist. What started off as a genuinely effective utilisation of the internet, a tool that governments and corporations had not yet properly understood, quickly became a method for the individual to represent themselves as progressive, rather than actually engage in any progressive and non-abstract activism. This is what I believe was the left's biggest mistake of the past 25 years: virtue signalling. Virtue signalling has been around since the dawn of time, most likely, and is a very human thing to do. People like to be perceived as people of virtue, whatever virtue their society currently rewards. We show off our expensive cars to exemplify our ambition and wealth. We show off pictures of our birthday party to exemplify how well liked we are and how many friends we have. We make video essays to prove to people how smart we are. This is perfectly normal behaviour. The problem with it in this case is that, in what Angela Nagle calls the online economy of virtue, progressive views started to become valuable social currency. College campus politics, which spread onto social media sites like Tumblr and Twitter, would centre around sensitivity, identity and call-outs, unfortunately leading to, at least what was perceived as, a performative culture surrounding said progressive topics. This is what led to what I believe was the left's second biggest mistake of the past 25 years: the abandonment of transgression. Transgression started to be seen by the very active online left as the antithesis of progressivism. Racism, sexism, homophobia, joke or not, was starting to be uncharacteristically sterilised and unexcused no matter the context. Articles and think pieces started to pop up criticising comedians, showrunners, and celebrities for things it deemed amoral and counterintuitive to the left-wing ethos. I really don't want to spend too much time on this, as this is a topic that to this day is still being beaten to death by people like Ricky Gervais and Dave Chappelle, who make millions of dollars from rambling about cancel culture before returning to their mansions. And so I don't believe spending time on this is at all necessary. So, long story short, there was a time, circa 2014 to 2020, in which a lot of the online left engaged in pretty extreme forms of attempted censorship to anything they deemed morally transgressive. Anyways, back to the point at hand, I said the word uncharacteristically earlier because transgression was always a thing of the left. Free speech, offensive humour, provocation, sexual liberation were all very much associated with the left for quite some time. But because of this a new economy of virtue, the left abandoned it and instead adopted far more rigid, obedient and morally superior methods of enacting their politics. Long gone were the days of Giovanni's Room and the Sex Pistols' Silver Jubilee. Now the focus point had become emotionally charged and individualised identity politics. Whenever a group establishes themselves as serious, black and white and morally superior, they immediately open themselves up to ridicule and backlash, and before we knew it, the left had fallen into the exact same trap that the right had inhabited for decades before. The right were now the rock stars who were sticking it to the squares with their uncensored takes and slick talking debate skills. During the run-up to Trump's win at the 2016 election, and for a few years after the fact, every teenager's YouTube recommendations were flooded with videos of liberals getting owned, and feminists getting destroyed by the likes of Ben Shapiro and Gavin McInnes and all the rest, quietly radicalising young people to the alt-right and creating a whole generation of racist nationalists. It was admittedly a genius play from the far right to let the left hang themselves by entering debates from purely emotional and performative foundations, only to be completely eviscerated by quickly delivered quote-unquote facts and logic. Trump's election into the White House, with his over-the-top and admittedly humorous personality, further cemented the right as the new cool kids on the block. I remember watching these videos myself when I was 15 or so, and I admit to being entertained by them quite a bit. I was nowhere near as political back then as I am now, and spent most of my time smoking weed and watching movies, and so they just served as entertainment while I brushed my teeth or waited for the bus. The people getting destroyed in the debates were idiots. This is something I believed then and something I believe now. But the right made it look like they spoke for the entire left, and therefore we were all idiots who would cry after being misgendered. It wasn't until a few years later that I realised just how much damage this right-wing online takeover had done, when I was surrounded by people my own age, men and women, who were convinced feminism was a cult of irrational man-haters, who thought liberals and leftists were the same thing but deemed them as brain-dead anyways, and genuinely saw the whole left as people so desperate to protect their own feelings that things as simple as common sense had all gone out the window. Despite the knowledge that these pundits had been exposed countless times as idiots when actually debating someone who knows what they're talking about, the damage had been done. In retrospect, it was a pretty masterful move from the right. They understood, as the left had forgot, transgression is politics. A lot of memes were now distinctly associated with the alt-right's online presence, being used as ways to signal racist and misogynistic ideals. It was at this time, too, that corporations started to learn their way around the online sphere and involve themselves in meme culture. Memes were now bastardized by the right and corporatized by capitalism. The left, yet again, had nowhere to go but their own Instagram stories. In fact, I still think the left has nowhere to go to form a cohesive whole. The right still occupy the internet as a driving force, whereas the left is still abstracted through infographics and hashtags. Although, I think it is important to mention that the far right, although still very prevalent, have revised their strategy somewhat, especially after the Black Lives Matter protest in 2020. I believe this is largely due to Nick Fuentes and his assertions that white supremacist rhetoric should be delivered with layers of irony to make it difficult to distinguish intention. Extremist messages encoded in memes, often carrying with them disgustingly racist, homophobic and sexist rhetoric, now inhabited a meta-irony, in which the intention of the post could not be so clearly distinguished. A meme depicting George Floyd as a cyborg can definitely be defended by its creator as just a joke with no political intent, and that it was just an expression of dark humour. Yet the point still stands that There are now thousands of photos turning the photograph of a man who was murdered in broad daylight into a joke, rendering its original cultural impact slightly redundant. To touch back on Xiao Mina's description of what makes memes so special is that these George Floyd memes can be remixed forever and ever, contributing to a huge mass of surreal interpretations of a genuine tragedy. This is weaponized irony, the goal of which is to deliberately obfuscate truth for the sake of political detachment from who the right perceive as left-wing dissidents. All that criticise the right were labelled as fake news by Trump and his sycophants, while all that was overtly extremist was also fake news whenever they wanted it to be. I wanted to originally conclude this essay with the suggestion that the far right had won the internet, or at least had done so for the time being, but I've landed on something a lot more problematic. It is true that abstract activism and virtue signalling led to the collapse of a serious left-wing presence on the internet, and it is true that the right utilised transgression to create a pipeline that has influenced thousands of people to join their side in the past decade. But the issue is now that the right have also abstracted their own activist participation by weaponising irony and fake news, the internet, and in fact any form of media that mediates the consumer from the event. It has all now become almost entirely abstract in its reporting. I remember being sent a link to the video of Charlie Kirk being shot in the neck and watching it over and over again, formulating opinions and deciding who to send it to first. But I don't remember having much of an emotional reaction to it. It didn't feel real because it wasn't really real. Decades of abstracted representation and detached political engagement had completely numbed me to the point where I thought that I should feel disgust, sadness, excitement, anything really, but I just felt a general acknowledgement. Then came the memes and they made sense. It's true that memes have been and are still used for political warfare, and we have a very dangerous problem with the right's use of it, but even the right are starting to fall prey to their own trap. Erica Kirk has been laughed off the internet by the left, the right, and the apolitical alike because none of it feels real. A man was assassinated and his wife went on a grief tour and the whole thing was memed to oblivion until all that was left was ridicule and absurdity and nothing else. Genuine attempts to champion Erica as a new right-wing voice and deify her husband as a martyr and prove that the extreme left were terrorising Trump and the MAGA crowd completely failed because of the conspiratorial irony that they had been championing for the past 10 years. Whereas most people see this negative response to the Kirk assassination as a logical response to the absurdity of the ordeal, I think that this absurdity was in fact preconditioned into the Western psyche before Tyler Robinson took that shot. We have all become incredibly detached from reality and are now living in an accelerated version of the enlightened false consciousness in which we are aware of the horrors of the world but simply just don't care anymore because they don't feel real. I believe the Charlie Kirk memes are the cultural artifacts that represent this. This level of detachment can only benefit one group of people, and that group of people are the ones who rely on the proletariat's compliance. Jeffrey Epstein raped children, potentially ate them, and invited some of the world's most powerful people to do it with him. Our lives have been essentially confirmed to be controlled by billionaires who have sex with minors. Yet, a quick search of his name on Instagram will reveal a litany of deepfake videos of him dancing to trending songs on TikTok, or looksmaxing or some other viral edits put together in a few minutes. This mass compartmentalization of perhaps the biggest scandal against the capitalist ideology, an ideology that we all follow that can allow for the elites to do what they've been doing for years now, speaks to just how far we've fallen from our previous political participation. We're detached, cynical, and we should be angrier. But we're not because nothing shocks us anymore. And these people are fully aware and they're using that against us. So perhaps it's time we all stop laughing. ¡Asquerosidad! ¡Comieron humanos! ¡Yo les